Okay, this is Sophia and Mrs. B. One day Sophia was at work and she tripped and fell. And then when she sat up, rubbing her head and looking around, she was no longer Sophia Costello. Now she was talking in ancient Egyptian, and then ancient Tibetan, and then ancient Greek. Somehow she was remembering all of these past lives, and they were intermingling and coming together, and she'd heard about all this past life regression stuff. It was happening to her, and it was happening all by herself. In quick succession, she was remembering past lives. Suddenly, she not only knew how to speak ancient Egyptian, but also ancient Tibetan, ancient Greek, African languages, South American languages, 1,000 languages. Then she stood up and screamed, "Blind my eyes! No, blind my mind!" She screamed, "Someone quick, blind my mind." And then she passed out. She woke up in a hospital bed, and she pretended she was still asleep as she listened to the voices on the other side of the ER curtain. She understood them, remembering 1,000 lifetimes all at once, was maddening, overwhelming her. She had to get out of there, so she disconnected the doodads connecting her to the machines, then turned off the alarms, got dressed, and slipped out of the hospital. At home, she accessed the interweb and went through the internet in blinding speed. What was happening to her all of these lives she's lived? Who was she? What was she? She didn't understand any of it. It was all so confusing. Then on the interweb, she located the crystals that she would need in a local crystal shop. So she grabbed the tools and all of the lamps and the lamp cords and a power cord and all the other things in her house that she'd need to construct what she needed to build. Then she went into the crystal shop and bought some very expensive crystals from Mrs. B, the local free thinker. Christmas had come early, and then she asked Mrs. B if she had a long table she could use for a minute. Mrs. B was so happy at having made a great sale, showing her in the back room, and she moved some things off of the table and said, "There, you can use this as a workbench," and then left her alone, knowing that Mrs. B, she could watch everything going on in the back room from the closed-circuit cameras. And Sophia went to work, connecting the lamps to the crystals and to the lamp wires, and you turning on the iPad, and she began to hum almost song-like, a cosmic C chord, as the crystals glowed and their vibrations began to align. As Mrs. B watched, her eyes as big as saucers, the crystals began to glow very bright, till Mrs. B could no longer see the crystals clearly. What was going on? Gee, she wished she could slip back into the room. The crystals were changing. It was as if their atomic structures were aligning. And then the cameras went out due to static. So Mrs. B went back out front behind the cash registers and waited. And when Sophia came out from the back room, she had these crystals, only now they were perfect. There were 6 perfect crystal cubes, and she wasn't carrying them. Instead, they were floating above her head, encircling her. And as soon as she left the crystal shop, Mrs. B was on the phone to the ladies of her crystal circle, a group of local women who loved anything to do with crystals, in a conference call. While Sophia now had more space for her thoughts. She had transferred the memories of most of her past lives into the crystal cube. She was downloading her past lives. And so she had more space to lay out this geometric map of the planet that the crystals were acting like an iPad, and this like holographic this holographic map of the planet appeared in the middle, in space, just inside the room. Then one of the cubes crashed through the window and floated up to the telephone pole next to an electrical transformer box, and began to draw massive amounts of electricity directly from the box. It was as if all the cubes were connected, as was Sophia, and the ground began to shake, and it was all happening all around the earth as well, and 1,000 pyramids broke through the ground around the world and established geosynchricity around the planet. And then a humming sound, a vibration, began to emanate from these pyramids in the sky, as thousands of people, hearing the music of the pyramids, collapsed, losing consciousness in countries all around the world. And then thousands of crystal cubes began to fly out of the pyramids, almost like the pyramids were made up of these crystal cubes, formed from them. And they get above the heads of the people who had collapsed into unconsciousness. And then the consciousnesses of these people were being downloaded into the cubes. And when all of their past lives had also been downloaded into the cubes, the cubes then flew back up to the pyramids and reformed with the pyramids. And when it was done, Sophia also collapsed. And then the crystal cubes above her head, they paused for a moment, and then they also flew up to the pyramids. And then the pyramids flew away, getting further and further from the ground, tinier and tinier, till they disappeared from view and were gone. Then when Sophia woke up, she thought that she must have been mad. What had just happened? She thought, what a dream. It had to have been a dream. All of these memories of past lives, the crystals, and that song she had sung. How did it go? It was all fading so quickly, as if in a dream, and like a dream, it was soon forgotten. And by the next morning, she had forgotten the entire affair, and there was a curious thing. She now had the beautiful crystal ring that she did not remember purchasing. The only thing she remembered was falling and hitting her head the day before. Wow, she must have taken a real whack to the head, she thought to herself, as she closed the door to her house and headed to work. Part 2. Mrs. B gathered all the members of her Crystal Circle study group to attend the unveiling of a video that would prove that the age of crystals was upon us. So the ladies sat there, their eyes glued to what they were watching, as Mrs. B played them the video from her shop. So as they all watched the closed-circuit video of Mrs. B's encounter with Sophia, and they watched as Sophia assembled the lamp wires connected to the crystals, using her iPad as a control board, the music player, and some real space-age stuff going on as the crystals began to glow. And the music, they were definitely reacting to the music. And then static took over the video. And then when Sophia emerged from the back room, the crystals were 6 perfect cubes, and they were floating above and around her head. The cubes were floating above Sophia's head. The women, their jaws were all dropped to the ground. There was definitely a missing piece to all of this, because when the video had gone static halfway through, and they decided to go with what they had, and so they turned the 2 tables in Mrs. B's back room into a workbench with 3 of the ladies on each side, and Mrs. B at the head of the table. Mrs. B gave them a list of all the crystals and everything that she could remember seeing or could remember of the encounter, and then they set to work. And soon they had recreated everything. It was perfect, just as Sophia had done right up to the moment that the video went static. They were humming and playing the correct notes on the iPad and everything. Then they began experimenting, but nothing seemed to be happening. They were growing frustrated. And then Anna, one of the ladies, accidentally cut her finger, and a drop or two of her blood fell onto the crystal. it was like the air in the room changed, and something definitely did happen, although no one was quite sure what. So Mrs. B told Anna to put a few drops of her blood onto each crystal, all six of the crystals. So Anna did, and then, even though the crystals still looked the same, they did not transform into perfect cubes. Nothing had changed. Anna was convinced. She said she felt different. Something had changed. And all of the ladies believed her. I'm next, they all said, as each one of them wanted their own blood crystals. Mrs. B said, Jenny's next. So we'll go around the table in order. And so they all pitched in, and soon they each had their own blood crystals. Although they weren't perfect cubes, far from it. So the ladies took their blood crystals and wrapped them around with wire, and then put the wire through their hats, and so they turned their hats into these blood crystal hats, with the 6 wires coming out and the crystals floating above their heads, just like Sophia's in the video, except they were only floating there because of the wires. The ladies were so proud and happy to have their own blood crystals floating above their heads. Then, as they each left with their own blood crystals, as well as a thumb drive of all of the video and from yesterday and today, everything. Mrs. B said, "Knowledge shared is knowledge gained." Then Mrs. B uploaded everything to YouTube in hopes that someone out there would be able to fill in the missing pieces. And soon you could not walk down the street anywhere in the world without seeing crowds of people wearing these blood crystal hats. And nobody could actually prove that they did anything. Even though everyone was convinced something was up, no one could prove anything. Some people just laughed at them, but then a gypsy with a crystal ball, Esma, E-S-M-A, she recreated the experiment in her apartment, adding just one thing. Because she had a perfectly formed crystal ball that had been passed down through the generations, she also connected the 6 blood crystals not only to each other, but also to the crystal ball that had been in the family for generations.